memang ada tamu Profesor Prasenjit Biswas. Beliau sedang berkunjung ke Indonesia, keliling ke beberapa kampus. Kemarin di Yogyakarta, di Universitas Gadjah Mada, kemudian di Universitas Sanata Dharma, dan di Duta Wacana juga ya. Dan sekarang di Jakarta, beliau akan ke Driarkara nanti siang, dan sebelum itu kita pagi ini di Paramadina. Mungkin sebagai pengantar sedikit ya, Profesor Prasenjit Biswas ini seorang guru besar di satu universitas namanya Northeastern Hill University di India. Beliau mengajar filsafat, beliau jadi guru besar filsafat, filsafat yang beliau kaji itu ada istilah yang dia coba perkenalkan, the colonial philosophy atau ethnofilosofi. Dalam menawarkan pemikiran, tentu beliau banyak diinspirasi, tetap mempelajari banyak filsafat, pemikiran filsafat dari mana-mana, termasuk dari Barat. Nah, tetapi barangkali yang beliau ingin garis bawahi dalam presentasi kita nanti pagi ini, itu adalah dia menyebutnya filosofi from global south. Ya. Jadi dalam konteks mungkin dunia selatan seperti India, Indonesia, atau Asia Tenggara, itu pada dasarnya dalam setiap masyarakat itu ada filsafat. Ya. Jadi kalau kita bicara filsafat tentu itu terkait dengan budaya. Nah, penting buat orang-orang seperti kita yang mungkin berasal dari wilayah selatan, dari wilayah Asia Tenggara, India, itu untuk mempromosikan pemikiran-pemikiran yang kita punya. Budaya-budaya yang punya nilai filsafat yang perlu kita angkat dan kita dialogkan dengan berbagai pemikiran filsafat yang ada di dunia ini. Dan proses dialog itu tentu saja bisa saling kritik. Kita terbuka terhadap berbagai pemikiran yang berasal dari filsafat Barat, ya seharusnya juga pada saat yang sama pemikiran-pemikiran yang berasal dari filsafat Barat juga terbuka terhadap pemikiran-pemikiran yang berasal dari kita. Juga apa yang kita punya itu bukan sesuatu yang tanpa kritik ya. Jadi apa yang kita punya juga harus kita lakukan otokritik. Jadi kita punya sesuatu, tetapi sesuatu itu juga harus kita kritik, bukan kita semata-mata mengagungkan dan kemudian kita bela mati-matian. Itu tentu saja bukan dalam cara itu filsafat bekerja. Filsafat itu bekerja dengan kritik ya. Jadi kita memperbaiki apa yang kurang baik. Entah itu datang dari dunia kita maupun pemikiran yang datang dari luar. Jadi itu sesuatu yang harus kita kembangkan ya dalam konteks tradisi kritik. Nah, barangkali sebagai pengantar itu yang nanti akan coba disampaikan oleh Profesor Prasenjit Biswas. Jadi, how philosophy from global south shall be the future of humankind. Jadi itu barangkali, so we will give you the time, maybe 30 minutes to
which is a very rare kind of a rare combination of, say, the broader Islamic Indonesian worldview couched in very Western terms. It's not really a native kind of a university. It's a very creative synthesis between the native and the West, which Indonesia currently is undergoing. And an expression of this is holding this kind of a talk. I was overwhelmed by the discussion that I had with Dr. And I thank you all for coming here this morning, lending me an ear to respect data. But as I'm concerned, I want to propose before you a new way of doing philosophy, which we call as oh yeah, sure. So I should be here. Yeah, all right. Okay. So which I call as transcritique, as Professor Sunaryo just now explained. Transcritique is a kind of openness, opening our culture to the West as a response to the Western culture. We respond to Western culture by opening up our culture. Why do we do that? We do that because the Western framework of philosophy, which is broadly a kind of critique, which means a kind of a review and also a way forward, both a review and a way forward. So this Western critical philosophy, such as philosophy of Immanuel Kant, which you are aware of, and which Immanuel Kant has talked about, idea of conceptual knowledge, that knowledge is necessarily conceptual. And conceptual knowledge is based on some kind of universalist method of reasoning. We reason which concept applies to which objects. Who reasons? It is we who reason. So our own culture is based on our own ways of reasoning, our own ways of thinking, our own ways of feeling. So reasoning, thinking, feeling, which has to be complemented by doing. And doing what? Doing a certain kind of philosophy, which we call as philosophization. So thinking, reasoning, feeling, and philosophization is what our culture is constituted of. And we open ourselves to the West because we are able to match them in every aspect. We are able to respond to them in terms of our ways of reasoning. We are able to respond to the West in terms of how we feel about a certain representation or a certain event, or even, a certain kind of assertion of our own self-identity. How we feel about assertion of our own self-identity. In contrast to a Western universalist notion of what is called human, or what goes by the name of a homogenizing Western culture. We respond to the homogenizing Western culture by way of a distinctive self-assertion, by way of claiming certain truths for ourselves. We claim certain truths for ourselves. And these claims of truths are based on our response to Western critical notions of truth. Western critical notions of truth is all about objectification. It's also about constructing a set of norms, values, structures which are commonly shared and which is communicated without any distortion, so that everyone can be equal partner in communicating a set of norms, a set of values, a set of ideas. And this is what Western critical rationality calls as communicative rationality, as Habermas would have called it. Now, if it is a communicative rationality, it has to give a place to the large African, Asian, and other continental forms of life. These forms of life are not finding a place on equal footing within the communicative rationality, within the communicative framework of Western philosophy. And this has given rise to an idea of a kind of disobedience towards Western philosophy. And this notion of disobedience towards Western philosophy, which is called as epistemic disobedience. Epistemic disobedience is used as a kind of a tool to critique and question Western philosophy from our cultural point of view. And once we critique Western philosophy from our cultural point of view, we also have to rework on our own notions of truth and knowledge, such that our own notions of truth and knowledge are not just based on certain norms which are available in our culture, but these norms can be transcended in order to reach out to the norms of other cultures. So when we critique the West, we also critically examine ourselves so that our norms, values, and standards are able to respond to the norms, values, and standards set by another culture. And this is moving from one perspective to the other perspective. It's a kind of perspective switching. And the perspective switching is required in order to build up a shared critique. A critique of the West from our point of view, and a critique of our own culture by way of critical self-examination, by way of applying even the Western concepts of reason, rationality, their ways of categorization in our culture, to examine to what extent we are consistent, to examine to what extent we are rational, to examine to what extent we are able to have our own ingenuous claims of truth and knowledge. This is something very, very fundamental. And these fundamental issues are covered within the notion of epistemic disobedience. We are epistemically disobedient. We are not obedient to the Western culture. When we say disobedience, we mean that we are able to transcend the limits of Western epistemology. So what is the limit of Western epistemology? The limit of Western epistemology is this idea of a knowing subject that Immanuel Kant has proposed. And it's also the idea of an objective rationality, which is something like a mind-independent reality. But do we have mind-independent reality? Because Kant also says that we cannot have mind-independent reality. All that comes to us as reality are appearances before our mind, and these appearances are brought under certain concepts that are innately given in our faculty. So therefore, there is nothing like reality as such, or the real as such, or thing in itself as Kant calls. So Immanuel Kant would consider the real or the thing in itself as something unknowable. Now, do we agree with it, that thing in itself or the reality as something unknowable? Now, for us, reality is experiential. It's part of our lived experience, the way we live our life, the way we constitute our form of life, in terms of what we consider as just, what we consider as fair, what we consider as acceptable, and we create a certain criterion for acceptance or rejection of something. So based on our own criterion of reason, we would consider something as fair or something as unfair, something as right, something as wrong, something as true, something as false. That's based on our own criterion. And this criterion is something internal to our culture. Can the criterion of reason, which is internal to our culture, be sacrificed, be surrendered, in order to evolve a better criteria? Is a question of debate. And there are two sides in this kind of debate. One side of the debate is that the internal and external has to be balanced out. It has to be matched. And one has to evolve a common shared understanding of both internal and external, so that we do not indulge into epistemic chauvinism. So epistemic disobedience does not mean epistemic chauvinism. It does not mean wholesale subscription of the other culture. It means finding a point of sharing, a point of commonality, a point of fusion, a point of convergence, and also a point of difference. So both points of convergence and points of difference with the other constitute the link between our internal criterion and that which is external to our culture. And this is something absolutely needed to understand the culture of openness in philosophy. Okay, so this is one very, very important thing about transcritical understanding. The other understanding that I want to propose here is a certain kind of, as I was talking to you about, our experience of reality. What is our experience of reality? The experience of the colonized people of the world, is such that the framework of colonization is all about colonizing native knowledge. The native systems of knowledge are all colonized. And Michel Foucault argued about it. Following Michel Foucault, decolonial thinkers have also argued about it. Frantz Fanon, for example, his famous essays on Wretched of the Art, which is about colonizer-colonized relationship. And what is that relationship? The relationship is that of subjugation, subordination, and subsumption. The voice of the colonized is completely subsumed under the voice of the master. It's a kind of master-slave relationship, as Hegel espoused it. That relationship is not based on equality, reciprocity, but it is based on a certain kind of authority and power relation. It is based on a certain kind of hierarchy. Decolonial thinking is to break down this hierarchy of power relationship that obtains between the colonizer and the colonized. And in order to break down this power relation, how do you break it down? Well, Frantz Fanon suggests that in order to break it down, you need to create an alternative epistemology based on resistance and collaboration, simultaneous resistance to domination, and collaboration with scientific schemes of knowledge, collaboration with that which comes from the West as something liberating, something emancipatory, collaborating with the project of emancipation, and resistance to the project of domination is what Frantz Fanon suggested. And this Fanonian idea is further carried forward by the contemporary decolonial thinkers such as Walter Mignolo, who gave this idea of epistemic disobedience. There's also this idea of epistemic ignorance. And the idea of epistemic ignorance lies in the Western epistemologies failing to understand large amount of philosophical voices that are coming from the margins. For example, African philosophy, Japanese philosophy, or Indian philosophy at this moment are very much part of what they call as non-Western philosophy. So philosophy is categorized into Western and non-Western. Now this binary of being non-Western is something like accepting a place of subordination. It's not certainly an equal place with Western philosophy. Why? A perpetuation of the sense of inequality, sense of othering continue, even when Western academia is trying to talk about non-Western philosophy. Why that sense of othering? The sense of othering is because the Western academia is not able to comprehend the language of philosophy that is arising from the margins. Margins like, let's say, Indonesia, let's say, Nusantara philosophy. You have Nusantara philosophy right now, and there was a kind of a conference on Nusantara philosophy, and the kind of notions of social solidarity, for example, in Nusantara philosophy, who have developed, that has not found a place, in the Western discourse. You have your, wisdom-based philosophy from East Nusa Tenggara or East Java, for example. You have this notion of gotong royong, in the notion of gotong royong, which is not just about social solidarity, but it is also about cultivating an inner sense of Russia, an inner sense of feeling-based rationality. If you feel a bad omen that something evil is going to happen, that's symbolic and complicated. That's based on a certain kind of a ritual. And a certain kind of ritual process is also involved in healing, in curing, in transcending that process of feeling the bad omen. And all this is part of what goes in the name of Gotong Royong. And very interestingly, Gotong Royong is also something very personal. When you leave your country, when you leave your home, you are like a white chicken. When you come back, your personality is more colorful. You have grown so many qualities. You have come back home after visiting the world, You have created, you have gone into a new world. You have traveled to a new world beyond your archipelago, beyond your island. And you have come to Jakarta, Jakarta, and you have moved beyond your island. And then you have gone back to your own culture. So this movement beyond your own culture, beyond the limits and the limited spaces of your own culture, beyond the liminal spaces of your own culture, to a world of dreams, to a world of achievement, to a world of fulfillment. In order to acquire a new personality, in order to develop a new sense of living, a new sense of Russia, is part of your Gotong Royong. But that doesn't find a place within the narratives of Western philosophy. Similarly, the notion of Ubuntu, as we find in African philosophy, as we find in Congo, as we find among Bantus, Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I am because we are. Myself is constituted by the others. What I share with others. If I cannot share with others, if I am exclusive to myself, then that's a kind of an impoverished existence. The quality of existence is enhanced and sustained if I am able to share something in common, be it an idea, be it a material resource, be it a dream, if I am able to share with others. And I join others in their dreams, in their expectations, in their works, then that is Ubuntu. My joining the other. My joining the other also implies others become an essential constituent part of myself. I cannot define myself without the presence of the other. The other must be present in my life. others from my society, others from the larger society, something like Gotong Royong, going beyond the sense of community. It's a trans-community sense of Gotong Royong, which is present in Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is larger than Gotong Royong. Similarly, we have in Indian philosophy a notion of Swaraj. I'm not going into my slides now. I think then that will become a little. Let's have this conversation. We have this notion of Swaraj. Swaraj literally means self-rule. Mahatma Gandhi brought this concept of Swaraj, self-rule. What is self-rule? It's not just the rule by the self, not just the rule by the self, that I rule myself, I rule my own community. It's not just self-rule, but it is how yourself is constituted. Whether you have dignity, self-respect, and respect for the other, respect for the faith of the other, which is absolutely essential to have your own sense of self, as part of what goes in the name of Swaraj. So apparently the boundary between the self and the other is overcome. The way you move from your archipelago to the larger world, in the same way, you move from your narrow construction of self to a notion of being an other to the other. And when you become an other to the other, you are not othering the other, but you are taking part in the lives of the other as an other. And that is a transcendence beyond yourself. And this notion of transcendence beyond yourself is called as Swaraj by Gandhi. Gandhi wrote this famous text called Hind Swaraj. And there he expounds this notion of Hind Swaraj, which is a transcendence beyond oneself. And the transcendence beyond oneself is what Gandhi also calls as truth. A truth which is other directed, a truth which is not directed upon oneself. Your consciousness is illuminated by the truth that is directed from the other. In a sense, you are able to direct your own illuminated consciousness towards the other. And this is what in continental philosophy we have Emmanuel Levinas, who talks about responsibility towards the other. To what extent you are responsible towards the other? Though we can see in the current situation of Palestine, the responsibility towards the other is reduced to a mere responsibility to one's own kith and kin, by the larger Jewish community. Though there are dissenting voices who are talking in terms of responsibility towards Palestinians first, then responsibility towards oneself. Self-defense does not take away responsibility towards the other. This is the Levinasian argument. While going against the Levinasian argument, self-defense is leading to an indulgence into a process of persecution, a process of genocidal violence, which is not really the kind of Swaraj, the kind of transcendence beyond the self that Gandhi talked about, or it's not something like responsibility towards the other. Why at this moment we need to talk about this responsibility towards the other? We need to talk about this responsibility towards the other because we want to find an equal place for everyone, especially in the philosophical world. We want to find a place for the marginalized voices, the worldviews, the local wisdoms that are available in archipelagos, in islands, in east of Africa, in smaller African communities, and also among multiple indigenous, ethnic, and tribal communities across Asia, across Eurasia, which is about Russia and the central part of Russia, across Eurasia, across Africa, and all these multiple voices can be brought back into a proper place in philosophy, provided, if and only if we are responsible towards the other. We are allowing the space to the other, and we are taking part in the space that is there for the other or created by, so that we can now transversally, in a transposed manner, we can transpose ourselves to the space of the other. And once we transpose ourselves to the space of the other, a certain amount of transgression will happen. A certain amount of epistemic disobedience will happen. But at the same time, as we recollect what we have gathered or captured, we bring back home certain inherent wisdom from the other. And that inherent wisdom, the other, that we gather and collect and capture in our effort to become responsible, is once again a culture of openness, opening to the other, opening to the philosophical ways of thinking of the other. And this is much more than a dialogue or a conversation, because this is participating in the life of the other. As Rabindranath Tagore would have called in India, Tagore has espoused a notion of personality. It's going beyond, transcending beyond the notion of self. You transcend the notion of self by cultivating a sense of personality which takes you beyond what you have. And going beyond what you have is a kind of surplus. It's not just a transcendence of oneself, but it is also establishing a kind of a transcendental relationship with the other. So you transcend yourself in order to establish a transcendental relationship with the other, which Tagore calls as a surplus, which is a complementary notion of Swaraj, the notion of personality, or the notion of, you can say, transpersonal personality that Tagore tries to bring in, a notion of transpersonal personality, the most universal of all the notions of being a person, which is not confined to the notion of the self, and which is not obstructed by the binary between the self and the other, but which is opened up towards a possibility of setting up a transcendental relationship with the other, where self and the other are both transcendent. And that is what Tagore calls as a surplus. And that's something that frees you from the bounds of colonial exploitation, that frees you from enslavement, that frees you from the process of being colonized or dominated in terms of your epistemologies being subordinated by the dominant other. Okay. So this is another very, very important notion of decoloniality, or a kind of a transformational decoloniality that Tagore brings in. In the same vein, this famous Latin American philosopher, I'll just go to one or two slides now, without which, I'll just come back to this slide. I wanted to show you this slide. It's a sense of novel alternatives, beyond self-other dualism that Enric Dussel talks about. Dussel talks about an idea of soul. He calls it ensoulment. How the soul be transferred. It's transferred in a symbolic and an imaginary sense. Your soul gets transferred in a symbolic or in an imaginary sense in terms of your relationship to the other. And when that kind of ensoulment happens, ensoulment is the mark of human relationship. Ensoulment is the mark of relationship that goes by the name of alterity. This is Dussel's. I want to go to Dussel's. No, not on. Yeah, Onticanim. Fine, Onticanim. So Dussel is proposing an idea of ontic enemy, something that really exists. Does an enemy really exist? This is the question that Dussel is framing. Who is our enemy? Colonialism or the colonialists? Dussel would say colonialism is a process. It's a process of subjugation. Against this process of subjugation, an alternative process of sublimation, sublimating the reality of subjugation. Subjugation versus sublimation. If we're able to sublimate the process of colonization by way of an alternative understanding of the world, by way of freeing ourselves from the colonizer-colonized relationship, that sense of freedom, that sense of right, that sense of new articulation of what is true and what is false, is what is sublimation. So there could be novel means entirely new alternatives beyond self-other dualism. So no absolute enemy or true friends, but friendship, enmity is within the field of responsibility for the other. Now, he gives the example of Midrash from Torah, from Jewish texts. Torah gives this example of Midrash. Midrash as an example of a narrative or ethical rational tale constructed by this Semitic master in the face of the question, who is my neighbor? Which could be better translated as, who is she, he, she, who confronts the other in the face-to-face, or even who establishes the subject-subject relation as proximity. In the face of this question, that subtle, methodical expert in critical, ethical, rational categories answers it, structuring a narration with a pedagogical intention, which contains the story of a socio-political tale. So there is only a pedagogical intention, an intention about learning, an intention about teaching. It's not really an intention about creating an enemy or considering someone as a true friend. It's only an intentionality of transmitting the idea of responsibility or the idea of friendship or this idea of sublimation of what has been subjugated. When we ask this question, who is my neighbor? That's a very, very fundamental question. So Western epistemologies are critically blind to the question, who is my neighbor? When they consider Africa as a neighbor, they are not able to give space to multiple voices that are coming from the African continent. Philosophy in Botswana is one thing. Philosophy in Rwanda is another thing. Philosophy in Congo Basin is another thing. Philosophy in Kenya is another thing. And within those broad levels, there are multiple others who are clamoring for their own spaces, who are sort of juggling their ideas, shuffling, shifting, switching their perspectives. And a lot of openness and closure are being played out within that larger rubric of African philosophy, which is not yielded a place when we are simply looking at them as a neighbor. They are much more than a neighbor because they have to become part of my epistemology But are we able to make them a part of my epistemology? We're not able to make them. And that's where we need a transcritical approach. I will stop here. I won't go further. I'll answer your questions. But before I conclude, I want to say that philosophy at this moment in the West, people are talking about death of analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy has reached a dead end with this notion of truth, knowledge, and reference. It cannot really ascertain what is knowable and what is unknowable. It lends up into multiple paradoxes. And with the rise of quantum physics and a kind of philosophical uncertainty, seemingly unknown unknowables are taking over the known unknowables in Western philosophy. In continental philosophy, this whole idea of difference, as Deleuze has espoused, difference without a name, as Deleuze calls it. Difference is unknowable and unnameable. The extent to which difference can go, and the extent to which difference can come back to a certain kind of a subtle distinction between the self and the other, is ending up in a situation of reconsidering various kinds of experience as materials. And you have speculative materialism, you have object-oriented ontology, but it's not able to answer what is an object, what lies beneath an object, and what is beyond an object. Not able to answer. Now, if we take these questions as the major questions in Western philosophy, the question of truth and the question of object, let's say, how do we respond to this in African philosophy, in Asian philosophy, in Indonesian philosophy, in Nusantara philosophy? So we have multiple answers to this question, but they are not ready to listen to the answer. So I think we should have, which we are planning from our Transcritique group, we do not have much strength as yet. But I think Indonesia, with its 17,000 islands, is the right place to begin with this exploration into multiple voices of philosophy to answer the questions that are raised in the Western philosophy, or the questions with which we are now perplexed with about our own local wisdom. These questions are to be brought together in a platform to listen to multiple different voices from Africa, from Eurasia, from Indonesia, from India, from South Asia, Southeast Asia. And then one can see the clamor of philosophy, the cacophony of philosophy, or the kind of celebration or festival of ideas of philosophy, that we can all celebrate together. Sometime next year, we are planning to do that. Hopefully, I would get support from Professor Sunaryo, and they are willing to support. Okay, so with this, I stop here temporarily for your interest.
Thank you. Big applause for Professor Prasenjit. Tadi sudah disampaikan oleh Prof. Prasenjit. Menurut saya itu uraian yang cukup elaboratif dari yang tadi saya sedikit kasih pengantar, bahwa pada prinsipnya filsafat itu adalah sesuatu yang plural ya. Jadi relasi yang kita bangun dalam filsafat bukan relasi seperti mengisi botol gitu ya. Jadi gagasan-gagasan yang berasal dari barat atau dari satu wilayah tertentu itu kemudian memframe filsafat kita. Tapi dia adalah sebuah keterbukaan. Jadi tentu saja kita punya sesuatu yang bisa kita ajukan dalam proses kritik. Ya. Artinya kita dengan apa yang kita punya, tentu saja kita tetap melakukan itu dengan autokritik. Ya. Jadi kita tidak menerima begitu saja, tapi dalam merespon apa yang dari luar juga hal yang sama. kita tidak menerima begitu saja, kita juga bisa melakukan kritik, terbuka dan melakukan kritik. Jadi tadi juga dijelaskan mengenai kritik terhadap karakteristik atau cara kerja dalam filsafat barat, khususnya barangkali dalam tradisi yang mainstream seperti yang disampaikan oleh Immanuel Kant, yang membatasi misalnya dalam konteks pengetahuan hanya pada sesuatu yang bisa kita ketahui secara empirik barangkali ya, sehingga hal-hal yang tidak kita bisa cerap secara empirik kita menganggap itu sebagai sesuatu yang tidak diketahui dan bukan pengetahuan juga, kemudian kita mendefinisikannya begitu. Padahal tadi sudah dijelaskan juga dalam perkembangan sains semakin banyak teori-teori yang bermunculan termasuk teori kuantum yang mungkin di situ juga salah satu perdebatannya ya tentang materi empirik itu sebenarnya seperti apa. Saya mungkin persilakan ke teman-teman untuk mengajukan pertanyaan atau klarifikasi, bisa dalam bahasa Inggris atau kalau tidak mungkin dalam bahasa Indonesia nanti bisa diterjemahkan. Saya persilakan. Bahasa Inggris lebih bagus. Silakan. Ya, mungkin atau dan dulu ya.
Ya, ya, terima kasih, Prof. Uraiannya, bahasa Indonesia ya, kurang memahami. Jadi tadi udah dijelaskan bahwa filsafat yang plural itu masih ada tempat ruang-ruang untuk filsafat-filsafat yang terbelakang yang tidak terkategorikan oleh filsafat barat, Western philosophy. Nah, bagaimana kita menemukan relevansinya filsafat-filsafat selatan atau filsafat yang bukan barat dalam society, dalam masyarakat yang paradigmanya sudah terlimitasi oleh filsafat-filsafat barat atau filsafat yang cenderung positivistik materialis. Mungkin gitu ya. Thank you.
Important question that you have raised. In fact, we are still dominated by the Western powers. It's a fact of life. But at the same time, we need to undertake the task of reversing the social and political hierarchy that exists between us and the West. So how do we reverse that? We reverse it by forming a language of our own, an indigenous language, an ingenuous language, a language of talking to the West in terms of our own sense of self-respect, our own sense of dignity, our own worldviews about truth, our own critical self-examination and its terms of self-examination. At one level. At another level, it's also a kind of epistemic disobedience when we are going to critique the dominating discourse of the West, when we are going to critique the dominant notion of science, truth, or even mathematics, how those dominant epistemic notions can now be dispelled by bringing an alternative. And the alternative that we bring is critiquing their notions of truth, reality, and knowledge. We critique their notion of what they call as unknowable, as a presupposition to their notion of truth. We critique their phenomenological notion of truth in terms of authoring, in terms of becoming author of our own lived experience. Our own lived experience need not be authored by feminists or cultural Marxists from the West. These have to be authored by we ourselves in our own language. And this is how we can sort of obfuscate this social and political hierarchy at one level. Now, at another level, we must give rise to alternative modes of philosophizing, our own notions of community, our own notions of travel, our own notions of capturing something that is new, the way we conceive of the other, the way we establish our relationship of responsibility in our own terms, let's say Tagore or Gandhi's terms, or Dussell's term, or Amilcar Cabral's term, or Nusantara philosophy. These terms of philosophy, they have to be brought in our discussion so that we have these plural voices available. Whether West recognizes it or doesn't recognize it, doesn't matter. But from our side, these voices are to be raised now, high time.
Hello, thank you, Prof, for your explanation. Pakai bahasa Indonesia aja ya, Pak ya. Terima kasih pada Prof atas provokasinya agar kita bisa memunculkan filsafat kita sendiri gitu ya. Tapi saya sedikit ragu dengan proyek ini. Pertama, kalau kita ingin membuat festival filsafat dunia misal, kita mengakui ada banyak filsafat, tapi kita tahu apa itu filsafat gitu. Ada objek of philosophy. Maksudnya kita sama-sama sepakat apa itu yang dianggap dengan filsafat itu. Kalau tadi Prof bahkan menerangkan kita harus menghormati bahkan di urusan matematik, perbedaan tentang matematika. Saya tidak bisa membayangkan trajektori epistemic obedience ini diarahkan pada ilmu-ilmu seperti matematik. Bagaimana kita bisa mengakui 1+1 di Indonesia itu 2, sedangkan di belahan bumi lain, di filsafat bumi lain itu 1+1 sama dengan 3 gitu. I can imagine about that itu. Itu aja respon saya, Pak.
Very, very important question, because this question takes you to a realm of contemporary science as well. You know, so we all know that we count 1 + 1 = 2. But do we need to subscribe to this set theory? Set theory in which we know that set of all sets, which is supposed to be a superset, and each set, whether a superset is a set, you cannot answer this question. The superset is a collection of all the sets. All right. So the conceptual, logical aspect of mathematics is always subject of critique. You must have heard about Liar's paradox. You heard of Liar's paradox? No. So Liar's paradox is simply like barber shaves everyone else except himself. So who shaves the barber? Does the barber shave himself or herself? Barber shaves everyone else except himself or herself. That is Plato's barber. Plato developed this notion of a barber shaving. Who, by definition, is a barber? Barber is the one who shaves others. Then who shapes the barber? That's a mathematical problem. If a barber has to shave others, then who will shave the barber? And if you say a barber is the one who shaves also himself, change the definition. Then what happens? There is no barber for someone. So therefore, you cannot have a barber who shaves himself as well as shaves others. But if you can have that kind of a barber, which will come from our Asian African philosophy, going beyond the binaries of number theory, you have also have, apart from these kind of integers and real numbers, you have imaginary numbers. Have you heard of imaginary numbers? Numbers that are imaginary. At one level, a part of it is real. Another part is constructed to be square root of -1. What is the square root of -1? The value cannot be decided. So there is this undecidability within the framework of mathematics. Every framework of mathematics has this undecidability. Even in artificial intelligence, we are not able to resolve the problem of frame, the problem of halting, exactly when program will come to an halt. We cannot solve that. How long the program will run? Like you run a program in your mobile, how long it will run? How long it will come to a halt? When it will come to a halt? Can we predict that? We cannot predictably process certain outcomes going by the mathematical framework. So therefore, these critiques of mathematical framework can come from us. And the larger context of life is such that we can have a cultural understanding of Western mathematics as well. We understand it better culturally because it relates to our notion of self. It relates to our notion of soul. It relates to our notion of how we look at others. Mathematics has to be culturally translated and understood. If we have not culturally translated mathematics, then mathematics remains something abstract. And that abstract mathematics does not really answer many of our mathematical questions. Right? So you can always have an alternative mathematics to the mathematics given from a certain mathematical form. You can always construct an alternative. Right? And there is a search for it. Pythagoras' theorem was discovered much before Pythagoras' walked it out. Just yesterday it has come. You can see the news.
Terima kasih Pak Sunaryo. Thank you Mr. Biswa. Saya Dea, saya akan menyampaikan pertanyaan dalam bahasa Indonesia. Jadi saya rasa kita sangat setuju ya bahwa ada pluralitas dalam filsafat. Bahwa filsafat atau ya kebijaksanaan itu sangat personal sesuai dengan kultur kita masing-masing dan memang harus kita gali gitu dari kepribadian budaya kita. Tapi pertanyaan saya, apabila kita menerima pluralitas dalam pandangan filsafat, adakah sesuatu yang fundamental gitu atau prinsip yang masih bisa kita jadikan pegangan ya, supaya filsafat yang banyak ini bisa punya satu atau bisa ada tolak ukur yang sama gitu antara satu filsafat dengan filsafat yang lain, sehingga kita ketika banyaknya pandangan ini bertemu, ada satu yang tetap menjadi prinsip dari banyaknya pandangan filsafat. Terima kasih.
Question. And this American philosopher, Hilary Putnam, he argued that in order to recognize difference, even you must have shared background of commonality. Now, this is one way of looking at it, that we already have a lot of shared background of commonality, and this shared background of commonality is distorted, altered, and tweaked in the interest of power relation, in the interest of creating a social, political, and epistemic hierarchy between colonizer and the colonized. The colonized are supposed to be only consumers of knowledge. They are users of the tool. They are not the producers of it. Now we have to break these hierarchies because these hierarchies are artificially constructed. If we are able to break this artificially constructed hierarchy between one space and another space, between something that is positive and something that is negative, between something that is here and something that is there, we have to move through these hierarchies and have to level these hierarchies by creating, once again, an alternative narrative, by giving our side of the story, as I was trying to talk about in one of the slides. Our side of the story becomes very, very important. Are we able to tell our side of the story in mathematics, in sciences, in culture, in recognizing our own internal plurality? We have so many plural voices within us. Are we able to yield them a space? The more we yield a space to our own plural voices, the larger is the possibility that our own voices will be heard in a plural world. But we are not able to yield the primary space for a different voice. Once we have yielded the primary place for a different voices will find its own synchrony. It will find its own difference. And the dialogue will be a dialogue between, synchrony and difference. It will not be between that which are all alike, but it will be in equal terms between the different points of view, between even synchronous points. So dialogue has to be plural by its nature, and each dialogue partner has to be given an equal place, which is undistorted by the existing hierarchies between the self and the other. And that is how we can recover.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum. My name is Natricia. I want to ask about, I have two questions. Why is Western philosophy so important? Is it essential and fundamental for humans being? Is the first one. And the second one, what the difference is between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy? Thank you so much.
Western philosophy, by its current trends, is a highly divided house. You have analytic philosophy on the one hand. On the other hand, you have continental philosophy. Analytic philosophy is trying to do a linguistic analysis. Ultimately, analysis of language is the criterion for understanding, for knowledge, and for truth in analytic philosophy. In continental philosophy, the reality that is disclosed through language, as Heidegger would say, disclosure of the world, how the world is constituted by your experience, by your first person experience, or by third person experience, or by second person experience, I thou relationship, Martin Buber. When we are talking, you and me, how through our talk between you and me, we are constituting our world. That world is neither your world nor my world. Together, by talking to each other in equal terms, by allowing you to talk and you are allowing me to talk, in that process of mutual talking to each other, mutual dialoguing with each other, we are creating a shared world. Let's call it a second person. And there could be a third personal world where we are looking at the world from a very objectivistic point of view. We're objectifying everything. Now these are three different kind of perspectives. First person perspective is one kind of perspective where you are talking about your individual consciousness. Second person perspective is shared with someone else. And the third person perspective is to look at someone else's perspective from your point. So there could be multiple such perspectives. So what Western philosophers are now arguing is about perspective switching. How do I put myself in your place, in your shoes, to understand your pain? And reciprocally, how do you place yourself in someone else's shoe to understand your heart pain? And whether we can have a social shared understanding of the pain, the common pain that is there in the society. That's Western philosophy. Now, this approach is very humane. What we are trying to do is to rediscover what is humane, not just what is human. Being humane is different from being human. And to be humane is to listen to the other human being, is to discover humanity. So in order to discover humanity, we have to listen to their voice. We have to see not just where we agree to them, but where we even disagree radically or totally disagree. But I want to listen to a totally different perspective with which I disagree. That kind of perspective is coming from Asia, from archipelago, from island nations, from various kinds of smaller places, which are not recognizable in the map of the world in terms of a big state. So we are not going by the big state, but we are going by small group identity, individual voices that respond to the other, voices that try to listen to the other. Those voices are important for philosophizing. An art of listening to the other, and then responding by placing oneself, by sharing the subjectivity of the other, almost in the vein of being a poet, kind of a poetic way of doing philosophy, which is called as poiesis. And Eastern philosophers are more intuitive, poetic, mystical, transcendental, in listening to the voice of the other. And this way of doing philosophy is to become more and more humane than what we are today. We have to become more and more humane than what we are today by way of philosophizing. And this is what Western philosophy tells us. So therefore, this binary between West and the East that is created by the long colonial history or the post-colonial times, as you pointed out, till now we are dominated, has to be decolonized. The colonial infrastructure of our mind needs to be deconstructed. And it has to give way to something that is original, something that is ingenuous, something that is coming from the ground, from our own wisdom, from our own community. And this is how we bring.
Apakah masih ada lagi?
Thanks for the opportunity. Okay, I'm sorry if I'm have a mistake because I'm start beginner. Okay, I have a question. Okay, the question is, I got the three crucial thing. Like you said before, is the first one is thinking, reasoning, and feeling, right? I'm just thinking about that, but in the fact in Indonesian, we can combine with thinking, reasoning, with feeling, because in Indonesian, feeling is just feeling. We can combine with thinking or reasoning, but in the philosophy, it's three crucial thing, and they have a relationship. And my question is, how to we can application that three crucial thing, especially in philosophy, because I especially myself is I can't what is it, a combine feeling with thinking. It's so hard for me. Okay, thanks.
And this is a very important question, both in Western and Eastern. So first, let me answer from the Western philosophers. Now, let me start with Nietzsche. Nietzsche would say that our ways of knowing the world is based on our feelings. And these feelings are first-person feelings. These feelings are not third-person feelings. What is third-person feeling? Third person is to feel how the other feel about something. One of the classic way of asking the question is like Thomas Nagel, a philosopher of mind, Oxford philosopher. He was asking this question, what is it like to be a bat? Now, bats are like human beings, but they don't have vision. How do they recognize an object? If you don't have a vision, how do I know this is a muffin and this is a computer? Bats recognize it through echolocation. They have a sensor in their chest, in their breast, which would echo an object. An object will create an echo, in that sensor. Depending on the nature of the sound, the bat will echolocate where that object is, how that object. So what is it like to be a bat? Can we have that feeling? What is it like to be a bat? Yes, we can have it, but it's a third person. We cannot feel the way a bat feels it. Right? So the first person, the space for first person feeling is not covered in the way we think or in the way we reason. When we think about bat's feeling, how are we reasoning? We are reasoning by saying that what exactly the bat feels, that can only be guessed by us. We can only imagine. We can't really have that feeling. We can imagine that feeling, but we can't have that feeling. Now, not having the feeling and yet imagining how the other person feels or other creature feels is a third person perspective. Now, should our knowledge be based on third person? Is a question in Western. So one answer to this question comes from Professor P.F. Strawson, Peter Strawson. He's a renowned author. His famous book is called Individuals. He sort of described and defined who is an individual. So according to him, an individual is a particular who cannot be subsumed under a generic category. Like you are a human, a woman, and you have a name, let's say. Now, your name, can your name be now brought under the category woman? Can this category woman be brought under the category human? Strawson says no. If you do that, then you are abstracting the particular qualities of the particular being. The individual is the particular being. But this particular being of the individual finally gets divided, according to Peter Strawson. Gets divided into the mental and the physical, the inner and the outer. Once again, you can see here a dichotomy. The inner is your inner feeling. And the outer, what is the outer world? Can we have a feeling about the outer world? Well, from a third person perspective, we can feel the outer, right? I can look at my computer, I can look at Professor Sunaryo, I can look at you, I can look at him. But this is from a distance. We have a distant relationship with the external world. Now that external world causes certain mental content, right? Are you the owner of that mental content? Or you are merely disposed towards those mental? Is a question. So that question cannot be answered directly. You can say, well, I am just disposed towards the mental content that is created in me by the external. And I am not the owner of this. It's not part of myself. Though I am conscious about it, but yet it is not part of myself. You can see the dichotomy here between the first person and the third person subject point of view within yourself. So a feeling-based point of view, then becomes kind of a bridge between the first person and the third person. You can feel where is the difference. You can feel whether the way you feel, whether the poet has felt it in that way, or whether that person has felt it in that way, and in what way that person's feeling is different from my feeling. You can call it a feeling epistemology, an epistemology of feeling. There's a nice term, Prasenjit. Now, coming back to this concept, you know that there are rashas. Rashas is a certain kind of effect generated in your mind because you feel in a certain way. I feel angry, so I feel very disturbed, right? If I don't feel angry, then I don't feel disturbed. If I feel very peaceful, I am at peace with myself. No one can disturb my peace. So, feeling generates a certain epistemic state as well, right? From the Eastern point, we call it Russia. Feeling-based epistemology is very important both for Eastern and Western.
Yeah, I'm aware that we're really close to the end of the discussion, but this question is both for Professor Sunaryo and Professor Biswas. I'd like to know, I'm aware that Paramadina has developed this interest towards the research around the area of philosophy of liberation, post-colonial discourse. Projects and also from Professor Biswas, I'd like to hear about the how do I say the methodological approach that Transcritique is now using in terms of using the decolonial as this project of decolonializing indigenous philosophy. So maybe there was
Professor Sunaryo, you want to say something about this first, or I say first? No.
Our department is philosophy and religion. So by this terms, we want to make a dialogue between philosophy and religion. So it work. Yes. In the context of what proposed for the colonial philosophy and also ethnophilosophy and Transcritique, we think that this kind of philosophy is important for us to understand that philosophy is plural. So we don't understand that philosophy is only Western philosophy, but we have in our department Islamic philosophy, and our Islamic philosophy also plural. We have Western Islamic philosophy from Andalusia, but also we have Eastern Islamic philosophy from Persian philosophy. So based on this plural philosophy, because the students study Western philosophy, also study Islamic philosophy from Eastern and Western Islamic philosophy. Also, we study Nusantara, the culture, the Nusantara philosophy. So we hope that the students can understand these plural voices that give the new understanding of us. I think in the context also person, we can maybe for the next we can collaborate to maybe making next lectures, also maybe research to explore further that we have Nusantara philosophy, not only Japanese, but also Sumatra, Borneo, Sulawesi, and others. Maybe
I mean, I'm very much fascinated by the question as well as the response that you have given. Now, we have this philosophy from Borneo. The philosophy of Borneo is by anthropologist called Monika Janowski. The name suggests that she is a Russian who grew up in Britain, and she teaches anthropology in SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies of London. And this book is called Tukadrini, Cosmic Traveler. This is a book about Tukadrini is the spirit in one of the Borneo communities in the jungles. And she establishes a dialogue with Tukadrini. And the book is about it. This is about Borneo. Similarly, about Java, East Java, we have already talked about. Apart from Java, you said some other state, Borneo, and then Sumatra. Yeah, about Sumatra also, there's a lot of interest about learning the Sumatrian kind of culture, especially in terms of Malaya, in terms of artifacts that they make, and the kind of chanting, the rituals that they perform while making an artifact, while making a mask, or while making the image of the artifact. Those images are partly spiritual and partly active. While making those images, the communities in Sumatra, they evolve a certain ritual process. This ritualized, not simply taking up a piece of rock or in wood and crafting it in that. There's a ritual meaning that is ascribed before them, before they make it to an art. Now, this is not explored. The process of meaning making or the meaning making process in Sumatra is still not known, and that's what has to be known as part of recovery. So like this, we have umpteen number of islands and archipelagos across entire South Asia and Southeast Asia, for example. We have lot of philosophical communities from Taiwanese, and west of China. We also have, let's say, Ainu people in Japan. They are Ainu Islands, a part of Japan. My grandfather visited Ainu Islands back in the year 1927. And he wrote a book the life of Ainu people. This is more an observation, like an empirical observer, what they do, what ritual they perform, how they live, what is their marriage norms and all that. But behind all this, he can also trace a certain kind of philosophical way of thinking. They think in a philosophical way about their own life. Ainu people. Ainu is an island in Pacific, which is away from the Japanese mainland. But Japanese philosophy doesn't accommodate Ainu philosophy. It doesn't accommodate Okinawa philosophy, the philosophy of Okinawa people, for example. So Okinawa philosophy, like Bantu philosophy, like Ubuntu philosophy, Okinawa people also believe in a Ubuntu concept. They believe in collective work and working together, and therefore they have a higher longevity than other people in Japan. So why Okinawa people have a longer longevity than average Japanese in Japan becomes an important philosophical investigation in their faith, in their worldview, in their way of thinking. So we have these multiple plural voices still to be brought into the mainstream philosophy, which we can bring by organizing a kind of a global philosophy forum or philosophy from the South. And we have many thousands of such philosophies. Once we bring them together, what happens? The entire scene of philosophy in the West gets changed. And this is where we need to. And this is what Transcritique was. As a methodological response, we look at their internal point of view. Why do they go for headhunting, Sumatra people? Why did they cultivate it? We will look at it. Why did they stop headhunting? What is the belief behind headhunting? We have to find it out. And that's an internalist point of view. An internalist point of view then has to be juxtaposed against an external, maybe a Western critical point of view, in order to arrive at philosophical arguments. If we don't do that, we exclude that part of philosophy from our scale and method of philosophical argument. Therefore, collaboration is in terms of recovering these philosophies and then reorienting them in the form of philosophical arguments that are available within those forms of time.
Saya akan masuk ke SDF Jakarta pertemuan sana dengan Mas Nirja. Jadi thank you very much for your kindness and generosity that I thank you very much, and because for we need to follow up this our meeting, maybe for research collaboration for the next. We can, I will contact you to your email. Yes. I'll write an email. This email is little obviously. I'll give you this. Yeah. This mailbox has got fit out now. Okay. But I'm giving you my WhatsApp also. That's absolutely needed. Buat teman-teman semua, terima kasih atas kehadirannya dan juga diskusinya, sangat menarik. Ini bisa semakin memperkaya kita, baik ke teman-teman yang punya minat filsafat Islam, atau filsafat Barat, atau filsafat Nusantara, tentu saja apa yang tadi kita diskusikan itu semakin memperkaya. Dan tentu juga sebagaimana yang dikatakan ada prinsip di mana kita tetap harus terbuka dan melakukan kritik. Baik terhadap apa yang kita punya dan juga terhadap apa yang datang dari luar. Jadi itu sesuatu yang penting dalam tradisi filsafat, sehingga barangkali setelah itu teman-teman akan mempunyai sesuatu yang baru yang betul-betul hasil eksplorasi filosofis yang sudah dilakukan. Terima kasih sekali lagi. Kita akan ketemu lagi mungkin next time.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. Saya akhiri. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Sure, sure. We will.
This is the first part.
This is for you.